This is a video presentation of measuring the costs of environmental restrictions on hydropower operations, a paper presented at the meetings of the International Association of Impact Assessment in New Orleans, May 1997. The authors of this study are Brian Edwards, Richard Howitt, and Sam Flaim. Since most abstractions are best understood with some concrete examples, we begin with a few pictures of the Flaming Gorge Dam and Reservoir, which are located in northeastern Utah on the Green River, a tributary of the Colorado. Although all hydropower dams and reservoirs are unique, our method applies to all. We will show you how the general method is used to assess the costs of environmental restrictions at Flaming Gorge. To be specific, Flaming Gorge is one of the 4 units of the Colorado River Storage Project, which was authorized by Congress April 11, 1956. The dam was completed in 1964. Water releases are in some cases regulated by treaties among states and Mexico. The dam is an impressive structure rising 502 feet above bedrock. The reservoir stores about 3.8 million acre-feet of water, and the surface area of the reservoir is about 42,000 acres, stretching about 91 miles to the north towards Green River and Rock Springs, Wyoming. A full description of the assessment method, including all equations, is available from the authors. Under normal operation, all water released from the dam flows through large pipes called penstocks into the power plant to turn turbines that generate electricity. This is a picture of the jet valve allowing water to bypass the generators. Water bypassing the generators is called spillage. The Flaming Gorge power plant has 3 generators, 50 megawatts each, which produce nearly 500,000 megawatt hours annually. The dam and power plant are operated by the Bureau of Reclamation, but the power produced from Flaming Gorge and other units of the Colorado River Storage Project are marketed by the Western Area Power Administration. To understand how hydropower operations can affect the environment, one must first understand that electricity production follows electricity demand. In general, electricity demand follows human activity. High demand during the day, low demand at night. To minimize the cost of meeting this demand, or meeting Western's contract commitments, hydropower generation follows demand because hydropower is relatively inexpensive, and generation patterns are flexible with small efficiency losses for increasing or decreasing generation from hour to hour. Many thermal plants take hours to reach efficient production levels, and most thermal plants, for a number of reasons, are more expensive to operate than the hydropower units of the Colorado River Storage Project. This is a diagram showing generation at Glen Canyon Dam, the largest unit of the Colorado River Storage Project, which comprises more than 2/3 of average generation available to Western to serve customer loads. The graph shows instantaneous discharges and generation during September 1982. Note that maximum releases during the day are 28 times larger than releases during the night. In September 1982, generation ranged from about 40 to 1100 megawatts every 24 hours. This diurnal cycling is the major environmental concern about hydropower operations. Dams and reservoirs have had many benefits and environmental impacts not related to hydropower generation. Irrigation of arid land was a principal justification for building dams. Irrigation consumes water, hydropower generation does not. Flood control has been another justification for building dams, which impound sediment and store water, whether equipped with power plants or not. Flat water recreation on reservoirs has little to do with hydropower generation, although our model shows how reservoir levels are affected by releasing water to generate electricity. Sport fishing is another benefit of building dams. This is a picture of Little Hole, a favorite trout fishing area on the Green River below Flaming Gorge Dam. The trout fishery was created when the dam was built. The Green River, which once ran with warm, turgid water during the summer, now runs clear and cold. Excellent habitat for sport fishing. The fishery below Flaming Gorge extends to Dinosaur National Monument. This is Echo Park in Dinosaur, at the confluence of the Yampa and the Green. Rafting is a popular recreational activity below Flaming Gorge. Some like it hot, some like it slow. Those are some of the effects of dams and reservoirs, but we are concerned with the specific environmental effects of producing electricity. We've been talking a little bit about diurnal cycling. high flows during the day and low flows at night. This warning sign sums it up pretty well. Water subject to sudden rise and violent turbulence. After sounding of a warning horn, proceed immediately to safety. A sudden rise in flow levels and turbulence cause a change in in-stream flow rates. Changes in flow rates are easily observed below the dam, but the effects attenuate further downstream.
Yeah. You think I'm okay? What?
These rafters on the green are enjoying a high flow release. When in-stream flow rates fluctuate, pool levels rise and fall, affecting fish habitat and spawning areas.
526-5199.
This is the Green River in Canyonlands, too far downstream to be affected by hourly changes in stream flow, but pool levels even this far down the river are affected by seasonal release patterns and releases over a period as short as a few days. Water temperatures are affected by hydropower generation, although a selective intake structure at Flaming Gorge permits warm surface waters to be mixed with cold subsurface water to achieve a desired temperature range. The selective intake structure is on the extreme left-hand side of this picture. The chemical and physical composition of the water can be affected by hydropower operations. Fluctuating flows can erode beaches and stream beds. This is a picture of beach erosion below Glen Canyon Dam. It is hard to tell what the beach once looked like. Hydropower production can also affect habitat for terrestrial species, increasing habitat for some and reducing habitat for others. This is a scene from the North Platte, a major flyway for North American migratory species. To illustrate how hourly flows can change over a period of months, we use generation data from Glen Canyon because the hourly events vary so widely. Generation data from Flaming Gorge, which we will show in a minute, varies by a factor of 3 or 4. Recall the generation at Glen Canyon varied by a factor of 28. We have created a three-dimensional data block that is 24 hours wide and 92 days long. This data block shows every hour of generation during the first quarter of 1983 at Glen Canyon. The values range from a low of about 40 megawatts, shown in red, to a high of 1100 megawatts, shown in purple. When generation follows load, the pattern of releases can vary widely over a few hours and a few days. This is a top view of the 3D data block, which is 24 hours wide and 92 days long. In this instance, and for the diagrams that follow, AM hours are on the left, PM on the right, and the beginning of the period is at the bottom of your screen. The end of the period is at the top. Moving the data block down to see the end of the period, pay particular attention to the double hump in the release pattern. Notice that generation at Glen Canyon often peaked twice a day. This is an orthogonal view of the data block, keeping AM on the left and PM on the right. The beginning of the period is closest to the viewer. We use a series of static pictures to show how a flyover of the data might look at different points along the data set. These images were rendered on an engineering workstation which has 8 times better resolution than this videotape. Once the data block is rendered from the data set, the image can be manipulated interactively to examine anomalies, holes in the data set, and data values that outlie the range of expected values. Even with low video resolution, the pattern of releases is easily observed. This perspective permits viewing the entire period at one time. We have shown you a pictorial history of generation and water releases, but how does one predict flow changes considering the wide range of hydrological and market conditions that can be expected? A first step is to combine temporal differences in the costs of purchasing replacement electricity with the availability of water or hydropower to meet contract demand. If the cost of replacement electricity was the same as the cost of hydropower, we would expect suppliers to be indifferent about how power is provided to meet contract demand. Also, if there are no temporal differences in the cost of replacement energy, there could be no savings to store water overnight and releasing it during the day. Fortunately, the power engineering literature provides a firm foundation to predict how thermal and hydropower plants would be dispatched to meet load. Dispatching thermal power plants is pretty straightforward since operational characteristics are similar and not subject to stochastic variation in weather. We built our discussion around Wood and Wallenberg, a graduate-level power engineering text entitled Power Generation, Operation, and Control. Hydropower is different from thermal power plants. Not only is each reservoir and dam uniquely different, every dam has different environmental constraints. The Wood and Wallenberg text develops power dispatching rules for all thermal power plants as a group, coal, natural gas, and nuclear, and hydropower is a separate case which requires special consideration. However, the literature stops short of incorporating complex environmental constraints. Wood and Wallenberg have developed a dynamic programming solution to the integration of thermal and hydropower generation resources. Their approach, like ours, involves finding the minimum cost trajectory to meet contract demand. This approach is cost minimization via the Lagrangian method, equating the marginal value products of generation resources. We have extended the Wood and Wallenberg method to incorporate dynamic head effects. The faster water is drawn down in the reservoir, the lower the productivity of the water release. We also have incorporated hourly release constraints to restrict the flow fluctuations we pointed out at Glen Canyon. We really want to focus on the complex constraints affecting the diurnal flow shape because this is the major source of concern about hydropower operations. It is also mathematically difficult and hasn't been done before. Once the optimum conditions for dispatching the hydropower facilities were derived, the model can be used to predict hourly and seasonal flow shapes, although the discussion focuses on the hourly changes. We are going to show what the hourly constraints at Flaming Gorge look like using the 3D data block. This time the data block is 24 hours wide and only 7 days long. We have shown 4 sets of constraints to make 4 separate points. First, a minimum flow of 400 cubic feet per second is shown in the foreground. A minimum flow of 800 CFS is shown in the second block. In both instances, minimum flows are floor values that cannot be violated. The third data block shows a range of possible flows assuming generation peaks once a day. The fourth data block assumes generation could peak twice a day. In both instances, we assume the maximum allowable change is 1,000 CFS per hour. You might remember in the Glen Canyon example that flows were peaking twice a day. This orthogonal view of the constraints gives a little better perspective on the constraint shape. The constraints are repeated for 7 days to reinforce the idea that constraints are assumed to remain the same over the simulation period. The structure of the model is conceptually pretty simple, even if the solution gets complicated. Inputs to the model are demand, which is another way of describing customer load, market prices for replacement energy, the cost of producing electricity from hydro sources, hydrology, or the amount of water available to produce hydropower, and reservoir levels, which allow us to calibrate hydropower production as reservoir head rises and falls. The model permits the user to change any of these input values according to scenarios of interest, and inputs could be generated stochastically to incorporate uncertainties about the market or weather. The environmental constraints incorporated in the model are also user changeable. The constraints govern minimum flow, hourly release rates, and the total amount of water that has to be released during the period. Other constraints, including seasonal constraints or constraints on reservoir levels, could be incorporated as long as they are specified beforehand. Recall that to minimize the cost of meeting contractual commitments, water is likely to be released during the day when demand is high and replacement power purchased from the market is relatively expensive. Because generation is equivalent to downstream flow, with some adjustments for productivity factors like head effects and attenuation, we've now identified how hydropower marketing is linked to downstream environmental impacts as long as we identify the flow constraints and market conditions in the service area. We have created another 3D data block to show the predicted pattern of releases at Flaming Gorge under the constraints identified above and representative market conditions. This data block is 48 hours wide and 30 days long to show a month of hourly hydrogeneration values and the amount of power purchased on the market to meet contract demand. For each hour of each day, generation is shown on the left and purchases on the right. The data object is shown for two simulation cases which represent two different sets of environmental constraints. A baseline case, which more or less reflects constraints on historical operations, and a low max case, which limits generation to about 75% of generation potential. This top view shows the baseline case at the bottom and the low max case at the top. Generation is shown on the left and purchases on the right. From a side view, note that under the baseline case, purchases are made during two distinct periods during the day, unlike the low max case. This pattern is driven by the environmental constraints. Notice the shoulders on the low max data block, whereas the baseline case is more angular and block-shaped. This top view of Flaming Gorge generation data shows the familiar pattern of high releases during the day and low releases at night. Generation is shown on the right this time. The low max case is in the foreground, and each day of the 30-day period is virtually the same, with a small increase in generation from day to day revealed during the noon hour. Keeping the low max case in the foreground, note the highly uniform releases predicted by the model. The historical releases we showed for Glen Canyon were not so uniform, but the pattern of diurnal shaping was apparent. The diurnal pattern is also apparent at Flaming Gorge, and we have some historical generation data from the third quarter of 1995 to illustrate it. This view has been reversed to offer a better perspective of the hydroshifting event. AM is on the right and PM on the left, with the end of the third quarter in the foreground looking towards the beginning of the period at the top of your screen. Moving a little closer, the shape is easier to see. Notice the one observation sticking way up by itself on the left-hand side of your screen? This is actually a transcription error of the raw data, which was left in the picture to show how quickly the eye can identify abnormal values with this visualization technique. The half-pipe shape in blue is the hydroshifting event predicted by the model, although in this case we are actually looking at historical generation, not model results. Why doesn't the historical data match the model prediction? Sometimes market conditions do not warrant hydroshifting, cost differentials are small, and sometimes there isn't enough water to shift into on-peak periods. The first quarter of 1989 at Flaming Gorge is a good example of low operational flexibility in a dry year. Remember the data block showing constraints for minimum flow? During the first quarter of 1989, generation at Flaming Gorge was nearly constant at minimum flow for the entire 90 days. What little extra water was available during the first quarter has been moved into the on-peak period during the day. Wet weather can also mean low operational flexibility. 1983 was a wet year across the Colorado region. In this case, there is so much water to be released during the month, the generators at Flaming Gorge were loaded to maximum capacity for most of the period. The few instances where flows drop below maximum generator capacity usually happen at night. The diurnal pattern is repeated, but not so extreme as might be observed during an average year. During 1983, the dam was nearly breached. No wonder flows remained so high for so long. Notice the holes in the middle of the data block. One wonders whether system maintenance was scheduled or the units were taken offline for a short while due to some emergency. To summarize some of our findings, we observe fewer hydroshifting events when weather is very dry or very wet, regardless of the environmental constraints. We also observe fewer hydroshifting events when the cost of purchase power is low, that is, being close to the cost of producing hydropower. By making a few assumptions, the cost of environmental restrictions can be determined. Hydropower operations costs increase about 40% from the baseline to the most restricted baseload case. The following clip is a short video taped from an interactive manipulation of the Glen Canyon 1983 dataset. The clip shows how datasets can be examined to explore relationships among the data elements and to determine regions of the dataset that are of particular interest.